Welcome, everybody, to Krystal Kyle and Friends. Today, we're happy to have Pisco with us. Pisco, thanks for joining us, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, guys.
So, I don't know if you saw this, but not too long ago, our president posted a threat to invoke the Insurrection Act. I want to go ahead and read it here for you. He says, if the corrupt politicians of Minnesota don't obey the law and stop professional agitators and insurrectionists from attacking the patriots of ICE, who are only trying to do their job, I will institute the Insurrection Act, which many presidents have done before me, and quickly put an end to the travesty that is taking place in the once great state. Thank you for your attention to this matter. So, Pisco, when I look at this, what I said to Krystal is, he already used the U.S. military to invade U.S. cities. He's going to invoke the Insurrection Act anyway. And so that's my thoughts on it. So I feel like, look, if you're out in the streets, you have a right to defend yourself. I, of course, think that the Democrats should order the police to enforce the law and arrest any ICE agent that commits a crime. But I'm curious if this sort of like intimidation tactic will work. And if it will make it so that, I don't think the protesters are going to listen, but do I think that Democratic politicians might like sort of soften their rhetoric a little bit? Like Jacob Frey famously said the other day that he wasn't actually ordering ICE agents to be arrested if they commit crimes. I'm curious what your reaction to this is.
Yeah, first of all, my take is completely the same as yours about he was always going to invoke the Insurrection Act during his second term. Now, it's the case that other presidents in the past have invoked the Insurrection Act. I believe the last time it was invoked was during the LA riots by the first George Bush. So my take on that, on like what he was willing to do, he may have been stopped in the first term during the George Floyd protests and riots. I don't know if you recall, he said that Tim Walz did a wonderful job in that instance. And by and large, even though there were some overreaches by the federal government, even in that 2020 summer period, they collaborated with state actors. And in this case, I think that he's determined to do the Insurrection Act. And one of the reasons for that legally is he just got a bad ruling by the Supreme Court on another power that he was invoking to try to federalize the National Guard in California. In this case specifically, it was from Illinois. And so I think he's determined to do it. Now the question is, what will the legal ramifications of invoking the Insurrection Act be? The first is, I think it's entirely unclear. The language in the Insurrection Act at times, unfortunately, is pretty vague. And the Insurrection Act is not just a means by which you can federalize the National Guard. It also is an exception to posse comitatus. Posse comitatus is the law that in general makes it a crime for the military, the like actual parts of the military, to enforce civilian law. And so the Insurrection Act is a very powerful law. Now, it wasn't envisioned that this kind of situation would give rise to the Insurrection Act. Like the Minnesota governor, Tim Walz, and the state actors, they're willing to play ball in terms of civilian law enforcement. They just want like federal ICE not to abuse their power and not to go and kill people and murder people. But that doesn't matter really, because the law, unfortunately, is a bit vague and it'll be up to the Supreme Court, which is stacked with conservatives, to determine the scope of the law.
Will they do that fast, Pisco? Like if Trump invokes the Insurrection Act and then there's a case over it, does it like go almost in like a fast lane to the Supreme Court? Or do we have to sit around and wait until the whole thing is over anyway for them to then rule on it? Because I feel like that's a cheat code to let Trump do whatever he wants. Yeah. It's like, we're not actually going to rule on this right away. We'll see you in 6 months. And by then, the thing's over anyway.
It depends, Kyle. If Trump is losing in the lower courts and he wants the Supreme Court to get involved, he has a fast lane. So there absolutely does exist a fast lane if he's on the receiving end of some bad opinions that he doesn't like. And what happens often is it goes to the shadow docket, the so-called shadow docket. And these emergency applications or these requests for temporary assistance, those are the ones that the Supreme Court rules on and kind of shows its hand on which direction it's going. The truth is, it took months for the Supreme Court to finally resolve like literally one or two interpretive issues on the other basis that they were trying to invoke to federalize the National Guard. But the lower courts, they kind of breezily will put in an order at some point. And if Trump decides to, or if he loses in the lower courts, is assuming he loses, right? The Supreme Court probably will quickly be confronted with like an emergency application from the Justice Department to stay the lower court orders, assuming Trump loses.
So the other thing that came out, I don't know if you've seen this yet, but in an interview with Reuters, Trump floated that maybe we shouldn't even have midterm elections. He was expressing, frustration that historically a lot of times the person in power loses in the midterm elections. He says, quote, "It's some deep psychological thing, but when you win the presidency, you don't win the midterms." He then boasted he had accomplished so much that, quote, "When you think of it, we shouldn't even have an election." So I see a lot of people theorizing that the invocation of the Insurrection Act could be sort of a first step towards actually trying to suspend or mess with the midterm elections. Is that, do you see any possibility of that?
Well, he literally floated this in the run up to the first transition of power to Biden. They were having conversations, if you recall, with like Sidney Powell and these other crazy people that they were proposing be special counsels to try to find fake election fraud that didn't exist. And so do I put it past Trump to try something like that? No. This is what I want to caution people, though. Don't get blackpilled and so scared that you do something stupid or that you start to think it doesn't matter and disengage, because that's what they want you to do. Trump will often float this, I'm running for a third term. By and large, the Constitution of the United States, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, puts the running of federal elections as a default presumption in state government hands. And that's what people are used to. They're used to their state and local officials running elections, yes, even for federal office. Now, Congress, if it wants to, can adjust the rules for the state and local elections for federal offices. But in general, legally, I think he's going to have a tough time using the Insurrection Act to justify fundamental changes to our elections. If you recall, the most important insurrection in our history, the Civil War, Lincoln had an election during that time. And famously, that was the precedent set by Lincoln there. And I think the Supreme Court and our courts will prevent Trump largely from trying to use the Insurrection Act as a way to bypass the actual midterm elections. That said, it doesn't mean he's not going to try. And it doesn't mean that I expect that this won't be in court sometime soon.
Well, and Kyle, he had also said to the New York Times recently that he regretted not having the National Guard seize voting machines.
That's right.
So this is clearly on his mind, and he could see the writing on the wall about his poor standing and Republican stand to, face major defeats.
Totally. I think we're in trouble. I want to ask you, Pisco, when the court rules on these things, do they look at it from just like a factual perspective? So in other words, when you look at like the tariffs, they could say, well, there is no emergency, and you claim there was an emergency, therefore we're going to slap down the tariffs, right? And I guess my question is, can they say with this Insurrection Act thing that, you effectively created the crisis, and now you're invoking the Insurrection Act. So if you didn't create the crisis, we wouldn't be here, therefore you're not allowed to invoke the Insurrection Act? Or do they do it more, is it more of like a textual analysis where it's like it's more abstract and it's more the specific wording in the Constitution and they take it from that perspective? How do they view that?
It's an excellent question, Kyle, and it gets to the heart of this entire administration. And it's not just this issue. It's also the issue of the Alien Enemies Act. It's also the issue of whether Trump can just stop congressionally approved funding. The question relates to who decides and how much deference is the Supreme Court going to give to Trump when he invokes these different implied powers or these different emergencies. Let me give you the bad news. The bad news is, I believe, that you have 4 justices on the Supreme Court, at least, who are willing to say, so long as the president writes a strongly worded memo, that we're going to defer to him when it comes to emergencies, basically of any kind. And there are even some lower federal courts that take this view, a kind of gloss on the unitary executive theory that says not only does all the executive power reside in the president, but on questions of national security, which he'll always just write a memo that incorporates national security or foreign powers concerns. They do this in immigration too, deportation of Mahmoud Khalil. What was the official reason? Well, it affects our international standing, or it affects our sovereign relations with other countries. So they absolutely will try to use those hooks to bait conservatives on the Supreme Court, of which I think at a bare minimum you have 4 who are just gung-ho willing to give deference. And the Insurrection Act, because it's vague, it's not clear who decides whether there is or is not an insurrection. And there's conflicting case law. There's some going back which says, well, the president determines certain situations when it comes to war and invasion, et cetera. But then you have the recent cases of the Alien Enemies Act, which says perhaps courts can review it. And that will be a factual question, as your question sort of implies. The more fundamental thing that we're not certain about is, under the Insurrection Act, how much deference do the courts have to give to the president's determinations as to the existence of one of the preconditions?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking too about the way that all of these deployments of these kitted out, masked federal agents, you know, ICE and CBP and whoever else is in the mix. I mean, they all look like they're in Fallujah. Like, they look like the military. And so on the one hand, obviously there's been mass public pushback to those invasions. On the other hand, there seems to be a concerted effort to normalize the idea of military troops on the streets enforcing civilian law. Because one question is what the courts are going to permit and allow, but you know, the population does get a say as well, as we're seeing right now in Minneapolis, where they're making it very difficult for ICE to be able to operate in the manner that they would like to be able to operate. And so I think that that's a part of the plan too, the previous deployments of the National Guard, and then the way that these federal agents are outfitted that look, you know, indistinguishable from soldiers out in the streets.
Yeah, I think that part of their calculation, is to provoke a certain response, to have a pretext. You remember the big balls guy from Elon Musk?
Oh, yeah.
He's one of the Doge kids who like was beat up or something. They'll try to find any excuse, but you can imagine when the people are trying to exercise their not liking having troops on the streets, that these kinds of tensions, the kind of tactics that some of Trump's goons are employing, or indeed even criminality, right, of the protesters / rioters in different cases, might cause one such conflict. I'm interested in that dynamic and how it pans out. I think it will be relevant to courts' determinations as to the existence of, for example, an insurrection. I'm also interested, and Kyle's first question alluded to it, the relationship between state and federal government, the federalism relationship, because that's going to be key and crucial. To what extent are the state governors, because most of this is going to happen in Democratic states, are they going to play ball? Are they going to try to de-escalate? Or are they going to try to, raise the tensions, raise their profiles? That's a decision that state governments are going to have to make. It's unclear how much legal authority they'll have to do anything other than file lawsuits and look for injunctions. And then finally, the party issue. The National Democratic Party, what are they looking to, and who are the leaders that are going to emerge that chart the right course?
So, Pisco, when I heard VP J.D. Vance the other day say that these ICE agents have, quote, absolute immunity, I couldn't believe what I was listening to, especially given the context of this is immediately after a 37-year-old woman got shot in the face 3 times, and what appears like, to most sober minds, a killing that didn't have to happen. What the fuck? Because here you have, we've always been taught nobody is above the law, right? I mean, even the president is not above the law. Like, that's how we're supposed to act in this country and what we believe in this country. And then he invokes absolute immunity for these people. I understand that for law enforcement in particular, they do have like a higher legal bar, and, they tend to get a little more leeway than your average person. I get that. But when you say absolute immunity, I mean, the point I made is, if the immunity is absolute, are they allowed to rape people? Because you said it's absolute. So can they rape people? So break down for me what the actual legal standard is, and how it obviously differs from what J.D. Vance is saying.
Yeah, so J.D. Vance is talking out of his butt on some of this, okay? He's invoking Trump versus United States. There's a notion of qualified immunity that certain officers have in the civil damages context. Okay, so when people start talking to you about qualified immunity, just know that it doesn't apply to potential criminal actions. That's a standard for judging whether you can find a government officer liable in a civil damages framework and for like departing too far from the Constitution. So there is some leeway there. But J.D. Vance is not talking about that, right? J.D. Vance is not talking about qualified immunity. You can't sue these people. What he's talking about is absolute immunity. And that is a concept that in this specific area, he's invoking with respect to Trump versus the United States, which found that a former president, there are spheres of core and exclusive executive power by which he cannot be charged. And it's a little concerning that it's applying to, or at least he's proposing to apply it to lower officials as well, including just like line ICE officers. But it's not surprising Because think about the logic of the opinion of Trump versus the United States. In that opinion, the notion is the president needs to have no limit on these very core decisions that he's making. So take that and then add the notion that the entirety of the executive power is vested in one president. This is the unitary executive theory. Well, 1 + 1 = 2. If the president his authority can't be questioned in the core areas, and if all of the executive power is vested in the president and lower officials are just executing part of the power of the president, that's the theory, then why wouldn't lower officials who execute that power also have the immunity that Trump carries, right? That's why the opinion in Trump versus the United States was so dangerous, because it rested on a foundation combined with the unitary executive theory, could lead to these kinds of claims. And so that's what J.D. Vance is invoking. It is, of course, incredibly dangerous.
I think it's really important to dwell on this for a moment, because I did not put that together. When I heard J.D. Vance say that, I just assumed he was, grabbing for some hyperbole. But I also know, he is a Yale-trained lawyer.
Correct.
So he is, he is not an idiot. He's very intentional, right, with his language.
Yes.
And so what you're putting together, I think, is extremely important for people to understand, that this administration's position is that not only is it Donald Trump who is above the law and can do whatever he wants, so says the Supreme Court, but because he has that immunity, everyone, Stephen Miller, Kristi Noem, J.D. Vance, Elon Musk, all the way down to the Proud Boy masked thugs who got 5 seconds of training before being sent out with guns to terrorize neighborhoods, that all of those people can do whatever the fuck they want, and there is nothing we can do about it.
Yes, and their internal logic makes sense, right? Their internal logic is when this Proud Boy ICE officer, whoever's doing this, right, is using any authority, that's just authority derived from the president. That's what it means to say that it's a unitary executive. All executive power is vested in the president. Well, if it all is there, then any use of official power is just a delegation by the president of the United States. That's why this case of Humphrey's executor, you might have heard reference to it, about the FTC and other cases involving executive branch officials who have some insulation from being fired from Trump. It's all related. They're trying to claim that the executive branch is his domain, right? But it's not just that, though. They're also trying to infect the other branches and say Congress can't do this, we can control appropriations, the courts can't review this. So it is a growing and expanding theory of power. But internally within the executive branch, their logic makes sense, right? You don't have to accept their logic, but their logic makes sense, which is all the power is Trump's. Trump's power contains immunity, and anyone who is using that power, borrowing it, it's as though Trump himself were on the streets. That's their theory.
Wow.
So
That's insane.
The feds are blocking an investigation right now. Can the state and local officials make a case without the feds' cooperation? Because at first they basically came out and said there's really nothing we could do if the feds don't cooperate. But then I heard some stuff that contradicts that after that. What's your assessment on that?
People have been convicted on way less, okay? I don't believe this whole, well, we need to have the ballistics, but it is true. And just, it's worth pausing for a moment to consider how insane it is that the federal government is icing out state investigators and state prosecutors from the investigation. That is so bizarre and wrong. And we just have to trust, after, by the way, firings in the very jurisdiction in which this occurred, because people are upset about what's going on within the federal government. We just have to accept their own investigation, which it's already predetermined. You don't need to ask the question. The guy's not going to get fired, and the guy's not going to get prosecuted from a federal perspective. So your question relates to, well, what can state governments do? I don't buy this whole, well, you need to have ballistics, you need to have the interviews they're having. No, I think that the state has jurisdiction here. If the officer is charged, which I think he should be, I want to be clear that this is murder, and we can talk about that if you want, about why I think that. He can invoke federal defenses. There's a statute which provides removal to federal court for officers in the line of duty who are being charged with offenses by state governments. That envisions, right, prosecutions of federal officers. So that clearly envisions Congress's decision to allow certain prosecutions from the state to continue. So I do believe that the Minnesota government has jurisdiction. I think that they should charge. We have eyes, we have ears, we can see the videos. Should they run a parallel investigation? Absolutely. Will there be an attempt to stop them? Yes, there will be an attempt to stop them. My view on it is you should subpoena these officials. You should do everything within your authority to at least try. And civil lawsuits are not enough. This guy needs to be charged with murder.
Yeah. Well, and actually the reporting suggests there isn't even the pretense of an investigation going on. In fact, you've had, career people who have resigned out of disgust.
Six of them.
That instead of investigating this guy for murder, you're investigating Renee Good and her wife for quote unquote domestic terrorism. That's how up is down, left is right that this whole thing has gotten. And, it's good to see some resignations. But to your point, we need a lot more than that. I want to get your reaction to that. I'm also curious on the specific technical question. If they do charge him and it gets removed to federal court, can Trump then pardon him? No, because it's still state charges. Okay.
Right. So the removal is just the forum. The idea is when we have our federal officers being charged by states, we want like a more neutral forum where there's more federal control. But it would just be the state prosecutors charging a federal officer in a federal court applying state law. And so that's what would happen. It would just be an application of state law principles by state prosecutors in federal court against a federal officer. So that's all the removal statute is doing. Now, the officer could try to invoke substantive federal defenses. There's this thing called the supremacy clause of the Constitution, which does say that like federal law is supreme, all state law and state decisions notwithstanding. But that's just gonna like re-ask the question of whether this shooting was justified under the Constitution and under the different deadly force policies that the federal government promulgates. And they're all kind of pointing at the same question of justification and self-defense.
In your professional legal opinion, explain why you think this meets the bar for murder, and then explain what you think their counter-argument will be.
Yeah, so murder is defined in the common law as the causing the death of a human being with malice aforethought and without justification. So just breaking that down, causing the death of a human being just means doing actions which are the but-for and proximate cause of the result here, which is causing the death. No one can seriously deny, right, that the shots killed Renee Good, right? That seems to be clear.
Yep.
Malice aforethought is a term of art. It's the mens rea component, and it usually encompasses intent or knowledge, practical certainty, in other words, except for certain situations like heat of passion defense. If you remember, like the gay panic defense, there was a controversy about whether or not that should be included, extreme emotional disturbance, but none of that is at issue here. So the only real question is, for purposes of either malice or justification, is there a justification to eliminate those other elements? So because the person who shoots a gun at another human being's head, even if it's not their intention to kill that person, they're practically certain that death will result as an element. So the only real question here, it's unlike the George Floyd case in that respect, because in the George Floyd case, there were at least some colorable arguments that it wasn't the hold that killed him, it was fentanyl, it was this or that. Now, I think those arguments were conclusively debunked in the course of the trial by the pulmonary cardiologist, but causation is not really an issue here. The big issue is gonna be self-defense and justification, which brings us to their defenses they could raise. But I just want to stop right there in case you have another question.
Nope, keep going.
Yeah, keep going.
Okay. So their argument is going to be that the use of force here, it's not murder because it was publicly authorized. And it was publicly authorized pursuant to the Supreme Court's rule on the use of force. And the Supreme Court has established case law from this case, Tennessee v. Gardner, all the way recently to a case called Barnes v. Felix, which establishes the test of objective reasonableness when it comes to the use of force. That firing bullets, for example, is considered a seizure under the Fourth Amendment, and all seizures must be reasonable under the Fourth Amendment, right? And so they're gonna argue that here there was an imminent fear of serious bodily injury or death to the officer or perhaps the greater public, and that use of force was necessary to prevent that threat. I think that that's a bogus and stupid claim. I don't agree with it, but people can have differences of opinion.
Now, him violating the professional code and walking in front of the car, does that sort of negate their argument because he's not supposed to be doing that?
I don't think that that's going to be dispositive, by which I mean, I don't think it decides the case. There's unclear standards on whether officer-created hazards are relevant to the totality of circumstances inquiry. That the Supreme Court, in this case I'm mentioning Barnes v. Felix, specifically left open, and different circuits have different opinions about whether officer-created hazards that are unreasonable should be considered. The policies, I don't think, are dispositive, because you can imagine, right? Trump writes a policy tomorrow and says you can use force whenever you want. And so we, of course, don't think that the policy dictates what the law is. But why is the policy relevant? The policy is relevant to the risk analysis, right? We don't think that the officers who made these policies just randomly picked policies, right? Presumably, they're doing these policies, for example, not to shoot at moving vehicles except for certain specific conditions, because there's an intuition that those are less safe, right? And so in assessing not just whether there was a threat, but whether the use of force was objectively reasonable, of course, if the shooting in its nature from the perspective of the officer wouldn't have the tendency to lower the threat because of inertia, because of physics, right? The car is going to keep moving at that distance, and it's going to do what it's going to do, regardless of whether or not Renee Good gets killed or incapacitated, right? Presumably the policies would inform what an objectively reasonable officer would think is likely given a shot at that distance, namely that the car is going to keep moving, right? Which it did, right? The car is not connected to the life support of Renee Good, and it's not like a dead man switch that when Renee Good stops breathing, all of a sudden the car stops. Different case if it's like a madman who's attempting to ram into someone else, where shooting them obviously would prevent the threat, at least in some respect. Or let's say after a long high-speed chase, which some of these cases involve, that shooting them just to stop them from driving at all. It's a very different situation here. And don't be fooled by the comparisons to the fact patterns from different Supreme Court decisions, which are very, very different. Use the principles that the Supreme Court gave us and apply it in your common sense and day-to-day, and using the expert opinions of course, the people who wrote those use of force policies.
What's your take on him switching his phone? So he's recording with his right hand, and before he even gets in front of the car, he switches the phone to his left hand, which many people are arguing that shows that it's premeditated there. He was getting angry, going back and forth with Renee Good's wife. He's holding the phone in his right hand, switches it to his left hand to free up his hand to go for the gun, free up his right hand to go for the gun. Do you think that's an impactful argument?
I think that the premeditation is not necessary to the analysis, but for people who are trying to make the argument, I haven't tried to do this because I don't think there's yet enough evidence, but as more comes out, we start to realize this guy has a history of this, that he was part of an investigation involving potential pretexts to use force in different contexts. And then his comment afterwards, I forget what it was. It might have been like,
fucking bitch.
Fucking bitch.
Yeah. So I haven't yet made this argument because I'm just like still getting the facts of that particularly. But for someone who was saying, not only is this unjustified, it was pretextual, I think that kind of thing would be highly relevant. Yeah, you switch your hands in that context instead of stepping to the side because you were planning to shoot all along. And the sort of shuffling there and his demeanor and her demeanor and his seeming anger and annoyance. And I think the wife of the decedent said something like, "You're fat," or "You're just thinking about your lunch," or something. Yeah. I think those would all be highly relevant to the kind of pretextual argument. I don't think it's that probative, but there you go.
Yeah, because after the fact saying like "fucking bitch."
And then keeping the doctor away. What about keeping the doctor away, Pisco?
Well, I mean, that's another question too, is because, so you have her shot in the face 3 times. The killer walks away and hops in a car and goes. The other agents who were on the scene, as far as we know, provide no medical assistance. There's a physician there who says, "Hey, let me go check her pulse. Let me go see if I can attend to her." They do not let him do that. The ambulance that doesn't get there for another 10 or 15 minutes cannot get to her because their vehicles are blocking the way. I mean, are the other agents involved here who do not administer or even attempt to administer any sort of life-saving care, do they face any sort of legal jeopardy here?
I think that is less certain. They tried this with Chauvin, some of the other officers, and in general, the American rule is there's no affirmative duty to save or rescue, even for the police. That's the general rule. Now, there's differences if, for example, you're helping some sort of illegal application of force, or perhaps if you cause the situation yourself. But I'm not so convinced that there will be a theory of liability criminally from the perspective of people who fail to render aid or prevented aid from coming. Though those should be analyzed differently, right? Failure to render aid as opposed to stopping
blocking
people from
aid.
Correct, yeah. So I'm not saying that I know that will be one way or the other.
Yeah.
I'm just telling you the general rule. And additionally, but put that aside, right? Like, they should be fired. They should be fired for not rendering aid immediately. They should be fired for those circumstances. And obviously, even if the guy isn't charged or found guilty of murder, the shooter, I forget his name, he should be fired as well.
What about the analyses that I've seen are fairly persuasive that Jonathan Ross didn't even get clipped even a little bit by the vehicle. But they're now out claiming, oh my God, he had internal bleeding and he was in the hospital and he's lucky he escaped with his life. And, you know, there are some videos where it looks like he may have been clipped. Does whether or not he was actually hit by the car, is that relevant at all? How does that factor into this fact pattern?
I think it's relevant, but to me, it doesn't change it at all, because whether he's hit or not, right, that's not the test. The test is objective reasonableness. And if he, in fact, was clipped, if he has internal bruising, as is admitted, how does that make the firing of the shot in that context have any more tendency to prevent the threat? Remember, guys, the test is to prevent the threat, not to punish the threat. And so the thing that I think has convinced most conservatives in my conversations is to focus on that point. Even assume that there's a qualifying threat of serious bodily injury that's imminent, right? Assume that. How does shooting the gun have any tendency to prevent that threat? And why would an objectively reasonable officer think that shooting the gun in that context would have any tendency to prevent that threat? And that has to be part of the analysis of objective reasonableness, right? If someone was shooting you from a given direction, let's say north, and a cop in anxiety just starts firing to the south, we would not say that those shots were reasonable. Why? Because they have no tendency to prevent the qualifying threat. And you know, right, as someone who's feet away from a car, that shooting the woman in that context, any objectively reasonable officer would know, has no tendency to prevent the threat, because the car is going to keep moving, right? So it's not, and in fact, that's why the policy exists. That's why it's relevant. The determination of these policymakers was, well, maybe having an incapacitated driver who's dying is more dangerous on the road than one who's alive.
Yeah.
And you saw the car accelerate afterwards.
That's right.
I know this is a simple question here, but how relevant is the direction of the wheel? Because to me, that was the thing where I was like, oh, okay, that's pretty black and white, in my opinion, based off the fact that it was pointing to the right of him. Is that something that, you know, factors heavily?
Yes. For me, in fact, it's super important, is the fact that there's no indicia that she was purposely trying to run him over. And even now, right, think about the crazy statement by Kristi Noem and the administration, their position that Renee Good was a terrorist who attempted to run over the officers. And here, by the way, I'm just using officer to refer to a law enforcement official. I'm not trying to make any determination that they're police or cops or anything, just heads up, because I know people are having a controversy over that. But yeah, I mean, that one, the turning of the wheel, puts to bed the notion that she was trying to run him over as her conscious object. But it's also relevant because if I did determine that she was trying to run him over, then I think the shots would be more justified, even in the context in which, you know, he's from the side shooting, because all we're talking about right now is the first shot, right? You have to justify those later shots too. All the use of force needs to be justified. That's precedent. Because someone who is trying to run over an officer, they have now evinced that intent that makes them this kind of imminent threat to public safety and to the health of officers, because of course, and killing them would be responsive and have a tendency to prevent the threat, because this person has shown that they are willing to direct their vehicle in such a way as to hurt people. And so that, I think, does a lot of work. So you're right, Kyle, your intuition is correct. And I think an objectively reasonable officer, from the perspective of this ICE official, would have seen those indications and therefore would not be justified in thinking that she was trying to run them over.
So let's actually talk a little bit about that distinction between an ICE agent and a regular police officer. Regular police officers can do traffic stops. That is part of their, you know, enforcement jurisdiction. Not so with ICE agents. So, you know, one of the things, like, I imagine myself like, okay, if I'm Renee Good and I'm in that situation and you have these guys running up aggressively and trying to rip her door open.
You're going.
Like, how would I react to that? That would be terrifying. I've seen what these guys have done to people and the way that they, you know, beat the shit out of them for absolutely no reason. In any case, I'd like for you to apply a legal analysis to even the, you know, the way they approached her and, you know, whether or not they truly were even within their jurisdiction to try to arrest her in that moment. Like, what was she doing beyond a traffic infraction?
I think, and this might not be what people want to hear, but I'm just going to tell you my opinion on it. I think that they're probably within their authority to initiate the arrest. Not that I think that she was guilty of any particular crime. I'm not saying that she committed obstruction, but these law enforcement officials, federal law enforcement officials in general, are empowered to arrest individuals who commit crimes in front of them. And the DHS specifically, under previous statutes, under the INA, the Immigration Nationality Act, has specifically given their officers who enforce immigration law, yes, immigration law, the power to arrest individuals who commit any U.S. crime in front of them. And so I don't really think that this authorization, as a matter of the murder argument, is that relevant. As a matter of public policy, of course it's relevant, right? We don't want ICE officers in general being in our neighborhoods to just be general, I don't know, law enforcement and to take over the roles and responsibilities of local and state police officials. So as a policy matter, I think it's highly relevant. I think it's something your audience should be arguing and debating and thinking about. I'm probably of the opinion that it was authorized to initiate the stop.
What do we do about all these terrible scenarios where people say to the ICE agents, I'm an American citizen, and like I can prove it, I have my papers, and then they like arrest them anyway? Because there's now been so many examples of that. In fact, I have right in front of me right now from twincities.com that ICE is holding 3 citizens who are Native American. And I haven't gotten into the details yet, but it appears like it's been for quite a while. What do we do about that, where you have these sort of like flagrant violations of what their mission is supposed to be, and there appears to be nothing to hold them accountable whatsoever?
First is to give people like you and Krystal a lot of credit. You guys were right when you were calling out the abuses against the easy targets. Who were the easy targets? The kids on campuses arguing for Palestine. Who were the easy targets? The people who came here illegally. The reason you were standing up for due process, free speech, all these rights as applied to the weak was because you knew, and we all could predict, if you were thinking about this clearly, that this would come upon citizens as well. And what you're seeing now are, yes, illegal arrests, illegal captures, illegal detentions of even U.S. citizens. Now, what is the approach? I don't think that the approach is to, therefore, resist arrest anytime a federal officer comes to get you, because they'll look for any excuse, right, to shoot you. Even when you don't pose a qualifying threat, they'll shoot you. But I do think it's really concerning, and we should all be aware and stay informed. That's so key. Staying informed of at least some of these cases will better arm you in your conversations with your friends and family about the kinds of things the administration is doing. I think it's possible, quite possible, that some of these U.S. citizens are being detained illegally under color of law. But that, unfortunately, without more facts, we can't make the determination just yet. There have been, though, plenty of right separations, even of U.S. citizens, that have happened under this administration, so it wouldn't surprise me.
We also see tons of videos of these ICE agents and other federal agents just going up to black and brown people and being like, let me see, you have an accent. Show me your paper. Where are you from? Based on like literally going up to the charging ports and the electric vehicle owners and like, you're black. I don't think you belong here. Prove to me that you do. I also saw reports that they're going door to door and asking neighbors, hey, where are the non-white families in this neighborhood? Point us, snitch on your neighbors and tell us about the ethnic composition, specifically door by door in your neighborhood. I mean, is this shit legal?
Yeah, so it's so funny you bring this up because it relates to everything we've been talking about so far. First, it relates to the policy administration, what they're willing to do. We have these crazy quotas that are being established by Stephen Miller because they want to like beat Obama's deportation record. But it's just the case that, you get for the easy apples first, right? You go for the things that are easy to do first. And the more you try to sustain high levels of deportations, which they are, it's not an order of magnitude above where Obama was, but it is a more above what Obama was. But it's harder. The more you start to work it, it's harder to do those deportation cases because those people don't have a criminal record or they're embedded in neighborhoods. So that's one way in which it relates to everything that we've been talking about. You asked, is it legal? Right? Before we had a case that went to the Supreme Court where in California, they basically had this pattern where they were going to places where a lot of Hispanic people stayed, listening to see whether or not they had accents and making arrests just based on like what these people looked like. And if you recall, this went to the Supreme Court and Kavanaugh was part of the majority, Brett Kavanaugh, that said essentially that you can consider background, including race and ethnicity, as part of certain detentions, a part of certain stops. And it's so funny bringing up the insurrection stuff, because the recent case in which it didn't deal at all with this, right? It was about whether or not it was proper to federalize the National Guard. Kavanaugh is crying in the footnote saying, of course, you can't use racist or ethnic protectual stops within the continental United States or something. He was trying to defend himself from the Academy and from online legal commentators who were criticizing him for doing quote unquote Kavanaugh stops. And so the priorities of Brett Kavanaugh and the Supreme Court seem to be like to protect their good name and to make sure they weren't taken out of context. It reminds me a little bit about Sam Harris. I don't know if you know Sam Harris. You, of course.
I know what you're saying.
Now, I like Harris on some stuff, but he's always there. I'm being misinterpreted.
Right.
Brett Kavanaugh is more worried about that than actually applying the law. Of course, stops on the basis of race, ethnicity, those are sort of classes under the 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause, that is applied to the federal government through the 5th Amendment. Those are suspect classifications that raise an inference of illegality. So I think that they're illegal. I think that we should get rid of these quote-unquote Kavanaugh stops, and I think the Supreme Court should stop worrying about their ego and their appearance and start enforcing the law.
Just a clarification on that. The thing that I saw, the footnote thing too, does it directly conflict? It seemed to me like it directly conflicted with what he had said previously. Like you could not, those two things did not go together whatsoever.
I think he's trying to carve out like immigration stops versus like criminal stops, but there's no basis to do that, right? The constitutional basis of both stops and the application of force is the 4th Amendment. And the 4th Amendment doesn't say, unreasonable searches and seizures, but different standards for immigration stops versus other kinds of stops. It doesn't say that, right? They didn't even have these kinds of restrictive immigration laws at the time the 14th Amendment was passed. And so it's bizarre, it's untenable to think that just the protectual, it's an immigration stop would change the standard. And of course, all you would need to do, therefore, to have like a pretty clear path to infringe on U.S. citizens' rights is just to claim things as immigration stops. And of course, everything the administration is doing is funneled through illegal immigration, is funneled through the terrorists, because that, of course, is what they feel is their strongest political issue. So yeah, Kavanaugh probably has some logic in his head. I just don't buy it.
So to Krystal's question, doesn't it violate the 4th Amendment to even just go door to door?
So going to someone's door, there's usually like an implied license to go all the way up to the door, okay, under the 4th Amendment. So knocking on people's door to like test the knowledge of the rights of the individual neighbors and to like ask for consent is probably going to be allowed. It's just, you know what they're doing, right? You're trying to go to these different places to see if people will consent to things, to scare people, and sometimes to conduct illegal searches. So going door to door without probable cause, a warrant, and or a warrant exception under the 4th Amendment would be unconstitutional. But just walking up to someone's door and like asking questions isn't necessarily, because there's kind of like an implied license to go and ring the doorbell. It's not like an infringement for someone to do that.
Then there's this other issue of oftentimes they're asked if they have a warrant, the ICE agents, and they say they do. But then you find out it's an administrative warrant and not a judicial warrant. Tell everybody about the difference here between an administrative warrant and a judicial warrant and what the different ones allow you to do.
Yeah, so an administrative warrant is one where there's not, from the federal perspective, an Article 3 judge who signs off on it, or a magistrate judge. And those are kind of members of the judiciary branch of the United States. The concern with these administrative warrants is it's entirely within the executive branch, right? Just like these immigration courts are run through the Department of Justice, Pam Bondi, who is having some troubles, I hear, is officially the head of all the immigration courts in the United States. Why? Because the immigration courts are executive courts. They're courts under the executive branch of government. Cam Higbee, very famously, this loser reporter, fake reporter, my opinion, didn't know that distinction when he was talking about Kilmar Abrego Garcia and said it was some like woke judge, but when it was an official under then Bill Barr. So the concern with administrative warrants, administrative courts, is if it's all housed within the executive branch, it's all subject to Trump. And we're concerned that like the warrants are going to be issued on something less than probable cause. Now, what is the legal difference from a 4th Amendment perspective between those kinds of warrants and warrants signed by either a magistrate or federal judge? Unclear. It's probably the case that those warrants are enforceable as a matter of law. But you will be able to challenge them, presumably, as not having probable cause or as being otherwise defective in a court of law. But the truth is a lot of these people, they don't know their rights. And maybe it won't even result in any criminal charge or apprehension. And in that context, what's the remedy? You're going to sue the federal government. The courts have made it so hard to do civil damages suits against officials. That's qualified immunity. That's theories of sovereign immunity. That's this case called Bivens. And so there's limited ways in which we can vindicate the rights of people who are subject to unreasonable searches and seizures through the administrative warrant process.
So my understanding was that they need a judicial warrant to come on your property in your home. That if you tell them, no, I don't want you here, and they say we have an administrative warrant, that you could say, that's not good enough. You need a judicial warrant, and it needs to be signed by a judge.
That might be true as a matter of policy. I'm not sure if it's true as a matter of law. It could be the case, and if it's the case, I'm just ignorant about it. But for example, the administrative warrant was good enough in the case of Judge Hannah Dugan. Do you remember the criminal proceeding against Hannah Dugan? It's not clear to me that those warrants are invalid as applied in the home. I'm not sure about that, and that's something I'll take a look at and get back to you on.
Can you talk to us about sanctuary city policies? Because one of the justifications you hear from the right is like, these cities aren't cooperating. They'll liken it to the, southern governors and officials who didn't want to desegregate. They'll say, how we need, this is like a rebellion against the authority of the federal government through these sanctuary city policies. So can you just tell us what sanctuary city policies are, what they mean, and whether this is at all a reasonable analogy?
It's a totally unreasonable analogy. I mean, what they were doing in the segregationist South was violating federal law by not actually enforcing it when they were bound to enforce it, right? When the Supreme Court says that you have to give equal access, equal opportunity for Black students in public schools, that is enforceable as against state officials. And so in the case of the segregationists, they were flouting federal law that was actually enforceable by those very officials. So there's a clear supremacy clause issue because you swear an oath to the Constitution of the United States, and the Supreme Court just gave you a ruling, you need to enforce it, right? And it applies to you. What's different in the sanctuary city context is, what is a sanctuary city policy? What they're saying is, we're not going to cooperate with immigration authorities when we have no legal obligation to do so. And there is no legal obligation to do so for state officials, right? Unlike the situation in which there is a duty for the state officials in the case of the civil rights context to follow the precedent of the Supreme Court. There actually is a federalism and Supreme Court concern against taking state officials and bootstrapping them for federal purposes. There's a huge structural component of the Constitution which takes as an assumption the existence of the state governments. And you're not just allowed to commandeer state actors to enforce federal law whenever you want. And so it's very, very different in the case of sanctuary cities, where they say, we're not going to do information sharing, we're not going to cooperate with you, we're not going to execute your warrants. It's merely the state acting as the sovereign saying, you can't commandeer us, you can't tell us what to do, and we have no obligation to enforce federal law in this context, unlike the context of the schools in the segregationist South.
Are you as concerned as I am that in every single arena, it appears like Trump has been emboldened? So, for example, they haven't released the full Epstein files. They've only released about 1% of them. That's in flagrant contravention of the law. In fact, they keep missing repeated deadlines that come up. You have, of course, what happened in Venezuela. You invade a country, kidnap the sovereign leader. There was no approval from Congress. You have now Trump's threatening to take Greenland. This is obviously another thing where he's not going to go through Congress. And if he did try to go through Congress, they would say, you can't do that. You have Trump now saying he's going to denaturalize U.S. citizens if they, quote, deserve it. From my perspective, Pisco, maybe you could talk me off the ledge here. Mm-hmm. It looks like we're witnessing a collapse of the law in this country. Is that something you agree with?
I agree with it. I think that we'll be able to overcome. I'm not black-pilled. I do think that this country will have the ability to throw him off, but we are in an existential state. I don't disagree with what you're saying right there. So let's take some of the examples that you're talking about. A lot of the universities and law firms bent the knee to them, right? CBS and a lot of news organizations bent the knee to Trump. Congress, obviously, the less you say, the better. Only on certain discrete issues where they push really, really hard, right, like the Epstein files, and stay the course, are they able to get him to acquiesce. And when they do, look at what we get. We get the law, which is very, very broad, but then Trump starts, not obeying the law, and we got problems all over again. And so we need to keep going there. And then obviously you have the foreign international actions, which are clearly illegal, right? There was no authorization for the use of military force in Venezuela. That was an act of war, whether it lasted a day or not. It's war. Imagine if someone came into the United States and kidnapped Donald Trump and like killed 100 people in the United States. Everyone would say we're at war now. And so, it's probably the Venezuelan government doesn't want to continue to have conflict with the United States because of how big we are. But, yes, that was an act of war. Obviously, Congress has the authority to declare war, and they have not authorized that action by Trump. Greenland, of course, that's not authorized if he were to do that. But is Congress willing to stop him? Is Congress willing to get in there and say, no more? Because the other countries sure aren't, right? The other countries, Trump kind of has them by the balls. The EU, Canada, Mexico, they need to walk around eggshells because there are actually a lot of things Trump can do to materially harm them, and they want to maintain their governments. So, yeah, it's a little bleak in terms of the international perspective. The thing that needs to be our focus, I think, is finding those areas like the Epstein files where he is vulnerable and creating new vulnerabilities. You see their approval rating of ICE. It's plummeted. They're now, I saw the YouGov poll, I think there's a bare majority that think ICE should be abolished.
Crazy.
So a lot of these, the people who I think are making a difference are a lot of the public intellectuals, the people who are actually giving out messaging, who are actually criticizing the administration. A lot of that is working. And I think that we need to continue to seek out vulnerabilities, not just rest on our laurels. And the Democrats can't fund this government. I mean, come on, with no deal, with nothing they get in response. I don't expect at all the Democrats to stand strong in this budget fight, not because a lot of Democrats aren't worth their salt. A lot of them are. But I think that there's at least a determining amount of senators in the U.S. Senate who have shown that they're willing to, with enough pain, bend the knee and fund the government. Who could fund the government now, though? Look at what they're doing. Look at what they're doing with ICE. I think that it's a time for our Democrats to realize, at least some of them, the existential state that we're in, and to put up all the stops and continue the messaging and continuing to seek vulnerabilities and to take calculated risks.
And, with regard to abolish ICE, I was thinking about this, even in the context of Venezuela, part of why, obviously it's illegal and immoral and all that to do regime change. But from a practical perspective, also, the military, the security services, the police, and also the guerrilla groups on the ground are loyal to Maduro. Like, they're loyal to that government. And so it's not like here where with the military, you assume that, okay, it's a Democrat administration, it's a Republican administration, the military is going to follow the orders. They're not supposed to be loyal to one commander-in-chief over another or have their partisanship override. And that's what's really different about ICE. Especially, I think this has always long been the case,
that's a great point.
But especially now with this recruitment surge, where you're pulling every Proud Boy and whatever thug signs up off the street and putting them out there. I think it's very clear that this is a rogue agency, and it's very hard to imagine that, let's say you've got President AOC that wins in 2028, that they are going to loyally and impartially serve her and her agenda. And that's, to me, what really makes them the definition of a rogue force that must be it can't be reformed. It's got to be completely pulled out, root and branch. Ryan was talking about, they did reporting back in the first Trump administration about when AOC and a couple other squad members went to the border. They got their hands on these Facebook message chats from inside of an internal ICE group. They were sexualizing her. They were threatening her. I mean, again, so you can't imagine that this is going to be some neutral, impartial organization. These are Trump and Stephen Miller's stormtroopers. That's what they're designed to be. That's what they are, and they will never be anything else.
I totally agree. I think that the language needs to sharply change into abolish ICE, and it can be premised on protection of U.S. citizens. That's what's so wonderful about the messaging opportunity. And I think the substantive position that needs to be what you just laid out, Krystal, which is these thugs are not loyal to the Constitution. And they're not going to protect you. They're going to protect one party, and we see the abuses. Take that messaging, just like Senator, Van Hawley, right, on Kilmar. A lot of Democratic senators sort of shied away from this issue that, MS-13, this or that. No, there's opportunity here to put it in terms of U.S. citizens, in terms of respect for our country. that it can be effective. And I agree with you on the policy. One quick thing on the Venezuela stuff.
Yeah.
This is to all those neocons out there, to all the liberal hawks. Even if you were to believe, and I do believe that Maduro is a horrible person, I do believe that Venezuela cannot be successful while he or any Chavista government is in power. Even if you believe that, though, why would you commit yourself to this action? Because you know that Trump doesn't care about the Venezuelan people. This isn't about drug trafficking. What this is about is either bucking China or capital ownership of Venezuelan oil for purposes of, keeping prices high with the Gulf states. And oftentimes it's just Trump's ego and Trump wanting, I heard it was partly because of Maduro dancing or because of a Nobel Peace Prize, but it's such ridiculous nonsense. But for people who are not committed to democratic reform in a particular country, in that context, how is regime change going to be successful, right? We had committed people who were trying to do regime change in different contexts before in the Middle East, and it didn't work. But when people don't even care, when they say poo-poo the opposition, what did he say about the opposition, Machada? I forget what it was. It was like she doesn't have
the support. She doesn't have the support.
So we're in a state where people who are committed not to democratization, where they haven't called for new elections, right? Trump hasn't called for new elections. He hasn't called for regime change in Venezuela to that extent. I think the project is doomed if it was, ever justified to begin with.
Pisco, how do you feel like we're in kind of a soft civil war right now? I mean, you have these, what is effectively Trump's personal army deployed into blue cities and waging a campaign of terror and, sort of all-out assault on the residents of that city, regardless effectively of immigration status. Now we have the threat of the Insurrection Act. I mean, how do you think about that? Where would the line be for you on that?
Yeah, I don't call it a soft civil war. It's a struggle for power, no doubt about that. Right now, what's going on in courtrooms, on the streets, is a struggle for power of who decides. Does the president decide what universities are funded based on what their protesters or what their students are saying? Does the president decide who a law firm's clients are? Does the president decide whether a court can review a given action? So on all levels, as part of Project 2025, through the ideological backing of a lot of weird sickos, the administration is engaging in a struggle for power across all institutions, to say nothing of the media, which you guys know what Barry Weiss is doing with CBS, what a lot of these billionaires who, look at the Washington Post, look at, which is owned by Bezos, right? There's so much interference, X to say nothing of that, right? So everywhere they're fighting. And so in that sense, it's kind of sort of like a civil war in that it's all encompassing. All hands are on deck and everywhere there's a fight. It's a total war in that sense. But I don't call it a civil war because I don't want people to be violent against the government. We don't do that right now and in any foreseeable future, I think, because peaceful protest, peaceful demonstrations is enough if we just raise the consciousness of our country. If we make sure that we're keeping an eye on the administration, there's much more of us, many more of us, than there are of them. And we can overcome through our elections, through our protests. And so I commend everyone who's going out there to demonstrate against ICE. And so that's why I don't call it a civil war. I think it's a struggle for power. I think it's a defense of the Constitution. And I think that we're going to win.
So when you look at Europe, there's a bunch of European countries that deployed troops to Greenland. And my reading of that is they're beginning to wake up and understand what Trump is and what we're dealing with here. That this is, I call it a mobocracy, because he runs the whole country like a mob boss, basically. Trump just seized $500 million in Venezuelan oil, and then he sold it and put the money in a private account in Qatar. I mean, this is
totally illegal. Yes, I mean, that is both unconstitutional from the perspective of emoluments. It's a bribery. It's also taking away Congress's power of the purse, right? Congress is the one that makes appropriations. So it's illegal and corrupt on every single level. It's absolutely insane. Yes. Keep going. Yes, it's a mob.
But what drives me crazy is, so now the fact that Europe is waking up, I actually find shocking, but they are. That's why France and Germany and the UK are sending troops to Greenland to protect it from us, to protect it from the US.
A sister NATO state, right? This
That's
is
right. Yeah,
a member of NATO.
This is what we're talking about. But at the same time now, you look at, Chuck Schumer, I saw the clip of him. He was asked about what happened in Minneapolis, and he signaled that he's basically not going to fight to abolish ICE or even reduce funding. And, I don't know what to do about the fact that he hasn't woken up. Democratic leadership hasn't woken up. There are some Democrats who, of course, have. But
Yep.
I don't know what to do about the fact that our best hope in really, fighting back in a serious way appears to be just totally complicit at this point.
You guys know me. I'm more of the DNC incarnate than you guys are. I'm more of a member of the team in the sense of I support Democrats unapologetically than a lot of people on the left. But
Although we've
Schumer
come more in your direction.
I know. I hear you.
Well.
I hear you. I think there's been movement in different areas, right?
We've come together. Yes.
Yes, and I think that's what's so beautiful about the moment is we're starting to see that our values are much more shared than populist right and populist left.
There is no populist right. Yeah, the populist right is fake. It doesn't exist.
Right. And so, me. I mean, I think there is that movement. Schumer has to go. And I say this as someone who has respected, legislation that Biden passed with Schumer's leadership, who respected, stuff that even Pelosi has done. Schumer has to go. I don't say that as an indictment on everyone in the Democratic Senate, but at a bare minimum, the guy I don't think is made for the moment. And with what happened with the shutdown before, where he's signaling that he's against ending it from the perspective of the Democrats, but he's pseudo-letting at least 7 or 8 Democrats buck what's going on. And behind the scenes, we have reporting that he's not at all trying to shift their opinion. It seems that he's playing a game with the Democratic base. He's playing a game to try to always wait to see the polling, wait to see. Did you see the response on the Venezuela strikes? It was embarrassing. It was laughable.
Yeah.
Rather than say, hey, this is a condemnable action. It's illegal. We're Congress. We're the one to decide whether or not we go to war with Venezuela. That was what the Constitution decided. He should be jealous of that power. Does he say, therefore, I condemn Trump's illegal action? No, he says, we should, you should consult us and maybe we need to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here's 7 paragraphs about Maduro being a dictator and then maybe a mild condemnation at the end. Yeah.
Do I think that, and similar to the stuff with Zoran Mamdani, do I think it really matters, the individual case? No, but it's indicative. It's a signal about whether or not he's made for the moment. It doesn't, whether Schumer condemns or not, at this point, he has some of the lowest approval rating maybe of any government official in office right now. I don't know that he's moving hearts and minds, and that by itself is a problem, as is the Democratic's image, brand issue. But that's what I mean is it's just a signal of failure of leadership at this point in time, and he's too old as well.
Well, I mean, Zoran, to your point, they expect us to all be loyal, vote blue, never criticize soldiers for the Democratic Party. You didn't endorse the Democratic nominee in your state. To me, that alone is disqualifying. That alone is disqualifying. And, I feel like there's this kind of, I interviewed Senator Chris Van Hollen earlier this week, who I like a lot and I think deserves a lot of praise for, you mentioned Kilmar Brega Garcia. He's been great on a bunch of foreign policy issues, great on Gaza, all of those sorts of things. Give him his flowers. But there's this sort of antiquated view about what the Senate leader and what the House minority leader is. They see it, the Washington brain is well, they're just they're negotiating these things in those caucuses. And it's no, we need visible public leaders of a movement against these fascists. And if you are in a position of power and that's not your mission, goodbye. You got to get out of the way for someone who is going to do that. And so, I mean, in a sense, I'm very heartened to see that a lot of base Democratic voters have their eyes open to that and are just as disgusted with Chuck Schumer as, if not more, as all of us are. Yeah. But here we are in the moment. You aren't powerless as a senator. You aren't powerless even though you're in the minority. And there just seems to be no willingness, no energy around using these few points of leverage that you have to try to force something. And I would say, with the last shutdown fight, the way they capitulated was pathetic. They got nothing for it. Now millions of Americans have their premiums lifted, just abhorrent. But even with that, within that failure, they did successfully put the healthcare conversation on the table. And it shows you that you don't just have to accept the world as it is. You can drive the conversation. You can make them have to respond to you. You can force the, you can force messaging on an issue that is uncomfortable and that is a bad issue
as
for
Republicans
them.
do. As Republicans
they
do
all the time. And even with the abolish ICE numbers that you were talking about earlier, the way that a lot of sort of like, center right and establishment type, or center left rather, I mean, they really are center right, but whatever, establishment type Democrats think is they're like, this is what public opinion is, and we just have to conform ourselves to it. Abolish ICE is now popular. Right? It wasn't a year ago. It's never, I mean, it's never been the majority position. It is now. Guess what? Public opinion can freaking change. It can change based on events. It can change based on messaging, but you have to actually get in the game and try to make that case and force the issue when you can force the issue.
Two core points of what you said right there are so important. The first is the nature of the insider's perception about what the job of Democratic leadership is, okay? Because that has changed. Yes, it still includes, I would say, 50% wheeling and dealing, keeping your caucus together. Side point, he didn't even do that, right? Because the official stance of the Senate Majority Leader or Minority Leader here for Schumer was to continue the shutdown. But the job now is for any of these public-facing roles, 50% bullshitting in public and public comms. It just is true. The job now is not just the job. It's also talking about doing the job and making it look like you're doing the job. And it's so the nature of the game has fundamentally changed. And we need to wake up about that reality. We can't just say, well, the minority leader's role is X, Y, Z, and we're never going to change it. That's the job. The job is different now, right? Trump has redefined the presidency. And the second core point that you made there was about public opinion. We cannot just be passive receivers of public opinion. If you ever watch the I think the movie is called Vice. It's the Dick Cheney movie, right? Who just died, by the way.
Yeah.
Where it's all about naming stuff, right? Think about the Republicans even now. Narco-terrorism. That's like a label being used to try to make the war an actual justification, right? Because we know terrorism, right? There was a justification for war after 9/11 because of terrorism. So just change the word, narco-terrorism. And so now drug importers are invading the United States and are therefore terrorists, and therefore war is justified. So this is a battle of public opinion. It's an info war, information war. And we need to be fighting that battle, and it can be done. And we proved it, right? Because as you mentioned, it was a brilliant move by Democrats to bring up healthcare, because there's so, it should have been obvious after Luigi Mangione, right?
Yeah.
People were shocked. Why are so many people supporting Luigi Mangione? And it's not just because he's an attractive guy, right? It's also because people are fed up. This is not to justify Luigi at all. I don't agree with that action at all. But it just should show you so much potential for Democrats to take the reins. And even in the embarrassment debacle, I think that the end of the shutdown fight was, it was brilliant to bring up healthcare, and it shows that there's opportunity.
And by the way, even though the Democrats ultimately failed, just the fact that they fought to some extent made the Republican numbers plummet off a cliff.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? So I've always made the point, yes, Republicans will hang themselves if you step out of the way and let them govern because they're satanic. But at the same time, if you also fight them, then instead of being up by 10 points, you'll be up by 20 points. And we'll be talking about prime FDR numbers. Yes.
Yes, we cannot be so risk averse. We need to win Alaska. We need to win Nebraska. We need to win Florida, okay? So it's just being like resting on our laurels and being like, oh, we're up by 4 or 5. 4 or 5 isn't enough for what we need. We need to have enough of a majority and a cushion that we don't have defections like we had from Manchin and Sinema in the first years of Biden, and also to start to make everywhere competitive. And if we don't do that, we're going to be like totally fucked. Because a future Trump is going to, we're not going to be able to put in the guardrails we need. We're not going to be able to build what we need and to have the social system that we need to prevent a future demagogue from totally destroying our country.
And as the old saying goes, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And that's exactly what I feel like about the Democrats. If you stand for something and actually fight on it, then you build it, they will come.
Yeah,
that's the mindset.
Pisco, last thing, how is the war of words situation?
Listen, the first thing I want to do is
words.
Is that what it's called?
Word war debate.
Word war debate. Okay, word war. By the way, their logo looks very similar to the original Breaking Point slogan. It's very weird.
Too.
Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so I participated in a debate about birthright citizenship. It was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. This organization is probably funded by a bunch of conservative money, but I don't care in the following sense. Just like you and Kyle do, Krystal, you guys go to have these debates, these conversations, even with people who you disagree with. And I think it's essential for Democrats and left-leaning people to go to these different places and to have arguments even in these sort of tough environments. So
if you're good at it, and you're good at it.
And
if you're not good at it, don't do it.
If you're Pearl Davis, don't do it.
Yes, which is, I'm serious when I say the following. Anna Kasparian, who I've had many disagreements with, probably had the most one-sided debate performance I've ever seen. It was worse than the Joe Biden debate performance against Trump.
Oh my God.
Maybe the Fetterman versus Oz one was worse, but Anna Kasparian.
Krystal versus Alyssa Slotkin, one too.
No, Anna. I mean, Slotkin put up a fight.
I mean, you smacked down Bill Maher, you smacked down RFK, you smacked down Alyssa Slotkin. You can't sell yourself
You do well
short.
on Piers Morgan. You guys do very well, and I know that you have a Piers Morgan segment coming out, Kyle. But yeah, the Anna Kasparian against Pearl. So everyone should watch that. Pearl was totally embarrassed and revealed as empty as much of this ideology is. A lot of the red pill stuff and the MAGA stuff. It's very empty and shallow. And all it took was Anna having a couple quips, asking a couple of questions, and just like clarifying a few things. And she totally fell apart and choked for various different parts in that debate. There's just like 30 seconds of choking. It was excruciating to watch in the crowd. And so, yeah, it was fun. And it shows that people can be convinced even in these sort of tough environments.
Well, people got to check out. You're part of that too. You're debating birthright citizenship, so people should definitely check that out as well.
Fuck the debate. Go subscribe to Pisco.
Yeah, do that.
Yeah, Pisco Liddy is PISCO-LITTY. Everybody go check him out. He does phenomenal legal analysis, of course. I mean, that's the big thing, is that if you ever want to know like the technical legal stuff, he's a lawyer. He's a lawyer by training, so he knows all that stuff. He can dive into all the specifics, and I love it. It's like nerdy heaven when I watch your stuff.
I appreciate it so much, Krystal and Kyle, and I like what you're doing, and I really enjoy. Whenever there's like some sort of breaking news, I just tune in. When it's a car stream, you know it's going to be spicy because that means there's some breaking shit that they have to do it on their commute. But thank you so much, guys, and I really appreciate the invite.
All right, thanks, bro.
Pisco. Good to see you.
Later.